This lecture introduces preferences into the Ricardian model, as well as explores the implications of extending the model to include multiple factors of production. Again, we start with the standard assumptions in the Ricardian model. We are still assuming the US and India are the only two countries, that only two goods, cloth and machines are produced, and there is a single homogeneous factor, labor hours, used in production. We continue to assume that markets are perfectly competitive in both countries. Given previously defined labor unit requirements and the magnitudes assumed for variables across countries, we have the PPFs again as seen here. Under autarky, as previously demonstrated, we have that the relative price of each product in both countries is equal to their opportunity costs, so production takes place efficiently on their respective PPFs. We are now ready to introduce preferences into this setting, but first, a primer on preference representation. In microeconomic theory, at the individual level, we characterize the problem of choice under scarcity as being resolved through a program where the individual chooses a consumption bundle to maximize her utility, subject to her budget constraint. To operationalize this, we start first by assuming that the individual is able to rank order her possible consumption bundles, which are combinations of desired goods she would like to have. She can do this based on strict preference or indifference in a consistent manner. If, for example, possible goods include cloth and machines, she is able to express some consistent preference ordering over different combinations of both. So, for example, she may prefer to have 2 yards of cloth and 3 machines to having, say, 1 yard of cloth and 2 machines. However, she may be indifferent to having the first bundle of 2 yards of cloth and 3 machines when compared with, say, having 3 yards of cloth and 1 machine. We can present such preferences diagrammatically with the concept of indifference curves nested within what's called an indifference map. An indifference curve is a locus of combinations of two goods that yield an individual the same level of satisfaction or utility. An indifference map is simply a collection of all possible indifference curves for those goods. We have depicted here an indifference map comprising of a subset of indifference curves which we have labeled I1 to I4. Looking at indifference curve I1, the consumer is assumed to be indifferent between a bundle at point A and a bundle at point B. So having 30 units of good A and 10 units of good B is assumed to be as good as having 10 units of good A and 28 units of good B. However, a strict preference is seen by moving on to a higher indifference curve, say to I2, where a point C giving the consumer 45 units of good A and 20 units of good B on indifference curve I2 is strictly preferred to either A or B on indifference curve I1. More generally, the following properties hold. All points on an indifference curve are equally desirable for the consumer. Indifference curves are downward sloping and convex to the origin, reflecting the technical concept of decreasing marginal rates of substitution across the two goods. This means that in spite of indifference over bundles, consumers are less willing to trade off ever-increasing quantities of one good just to have one more unit of the other good. Utility increases in the northeast direction such that higher indifference curves represent higher levels of satisfaction and correspond to strict preference. As a result, indifference curves do not intersect. Next, we introduce the consumer's budget constraint. The budget constraint captures the limits to actualizing one's preferences by showing possible combinations of desirable goods that can be obtained given her income. Algebraically, her budget constraint is represented by the following inequality that says Her monetary income M cannot be exceeded by how much she chooses to spend on both goods A and B. We can then rearrange this budget constraint by assuming that she spends all her income on both goods to express the budget constraint linearly as the quantity of good A being described by the quantity of good B. The consumer's budget constraint now can be graphed as depicted, with good A on the vertical axis and good B on the horizontal axis. The intercepts are given, and the slope of the budget constraint is the ratio of the price of good B to the price of good A. Alternatively, it's the relative price of good B. Finally, by assuming that she wants to maximize her utility subject to her budget constraint, this is equivalent to the choice of locating her highest possible indifference curve that is tangent to the budget constraint when graphed within the same plane, and choosing the bundle that corresponds to that point of tangency. This is what we depict here. If the consumer chooses any bundle on I1, she leaves money on the table and is not rational. Since she would like to maximize her utility, she can move on to indifference curve I2, and she can still afford to consume at point A, which lies on the budget constraint. That is what she ends up choosing, consuming A star of good A and B star of good B. It should be noted that while she would have liked to get to higher indifference curves such as I3 or even I4, she cannot afford them given her income. The budget line limits her and lies below all points on those indifference curves. This is the individual optimization choice. At the point of tangency between the highest possible indifference curve and the budget line, the slopes of both functions are equal. That is, the marginal rate of substitution between goods A and B is equal to the relative price of good B. This is an equilibrium condition for rational consumer choice. We can now apply this rational choice behavior from the individual to the country as a whole. Analogously, we can represent a country's preference over possible goods that it can choose by social indifference curves nested within a social indifference map. We continue to assume that these social indifference curves have the same properties as the individual indifference curves. The analog of the individual budget constraint is also to be seen in the country's PPF, which limits what it can produce of the possible goods. The societal consumption choice under autarky is to be found by the bundle that maximizes society's welfare subject to its PPF. So focusing on the US and using the illustration from our previous lecture, with a PPF given by the linear function QC is equal to 2000 minus QM, and with the resulting absolute slope of this PPF, which is the opportunity cost of machines, equal to 1, then under autarky, the relative price of machines is also equal to 1. We can identify the consumption choice society makes by finding its highest possible social indifference curve that is feasible. This will be on the highest feasible indifference curve at the point on that indifference curve where the marginal rate of substitution is also equal to 1. This is shown graphically, again for the US. Such a point corresponds to being on indifference curve I2 and producing and consuming under autarky at point A, where we have 1200 yards of cloth and 800 machines. We can now more precisely demonstrate gains from trade with the inclusion of societal preferences. Recall from our previous lecture that with trade, the relative price of machines increased to 1.2. This now allows a consumption possibilities line that pivots out from the horizontal axis from trade. This means it's now possible for the US to get to a higher social indifference curve representing a superior consumption bundle, where the marginal rate of substitution is equal to 1.2. An example would be if after specializing in machines and producing 2,000 machines, the US trades away 975 machines for 1,170 yards of cloth from India. This leaves the US with 1,025 machines and 1,170 yards of cloth. This is depicted in the graph. The US, through complete specialization in machine production and trade, moves to indifference curve I2 and is now able to consume at point B, which represents a superior consumption bundle to point A on indifference curve I1, which was production and consumption under autarky. To also see that India gains, recall that the relative price of machines in India before trade was 1.67. If we assume that under autarky, India would locate as well to its highest possible indifference curve that's tangent to its ppf at 1.67, then a combination such as 800 yards of cloth and 720 machines satisfies this. This is depicted in the graph. Here India finds itself on indifference curve I1 at point A star, which is where India would both produce and consume under autarky. Trade causes the relative price of machines to converge to the same as that in the US, which is to 1.2. So the new consumption possibilities line pivots out from the vertical axis as India specializes completely and produces 2,000 yards of cloth. By trading away 1,170 yards of that for 975 machines from the US, India obtains 975 machines and retains 830 yards of cloth. This lies on the new consumption possibilities line. Again, this is depicted in the graph. Trade causes the relative price of machines to fall to 1.2, which is a flatter line that pivots out from the vertical axis compared with the ppf. India is now able to move to a higher indifference curve I2, which is tangent to the consumption possibilities line at the consumption bundle B star, where the slopes are equal at 1.2. This is a superior bundle compared to bundle A star under autarky. Note that both countries gain from trade, and that the consumption possibilities in the two countries are the same. That is, the slope of which is given by the new relative price of 1.2, as their trades have to be consistent. What India imports of machines has to be what the US exports of machines. In this case, it's 975 machines. Similarly, what India exports of cloth has to be what the US imports of cloth. In this case, it's 1,170 yards of cloth. The summary of the Ricardian model with preferences included is as follows. Both countries gain from trade. This is seen by trade affording each country a move to a higher social indifference curve, reflecting a strictly preferred consumption bundle which would otherwise have been unattainable under autarky. Specialization is complete and is driven by the assumption of a single homogeneous resource, labor hours, which resulted in linear ppfs. We now relax this assumption and move beyond the Ricardian model to see whether our central results still hold. If we assume that goods are produced with more than just labor, but think of labor as being combined with capital or land or both in production, as does happen in practice, we now have the possibility of diminishing returns associated with the marginal product of a factor. The result is that the ppf is now a bowed out concave to origin function reflecting increasing opportunity costs from production. Such a ppf is depicted here. We still assume we have two goods, cloth and machines, but the presence of more than one resource used in producing both goods means that in order to move those resources away from, say, cloth to machine production, we have to give up increasing amounts of resources from cloth to produce each additional unit of a machine because the resources are not perfectly substitutable across the two production processes. As depicted, if we are initially at point A on the PPF and we wish to move production to point B on the PPF, we have to give up an increasing amount of resources from cloth production to do that. This is shown by the steeper line that's tangent to the PPF at point B compared with the line that's tangent to the PPF at point A. The slope of the PPF is still given by the opportunity cost of the good on the horizontal axis. But this opportunity cost is no longer constant but increasing. In our depiction with machines on the horizontal axis and cloth on the vertical axis, we can also represent this as the ratio of the marginal product of labor in cloth to the marginal product of labor in machines. So what does this mean for our previous analysis? We still focus on the US. Under autarky, the social objective remains the same. So the equilibrium condition has that the choice would be to locate the highest possible social indifference curve that is tangent to the nonlinear PPF. Analytically, the slopes of both have to be equal, or that the marginal rate of substitution between cloth and machines has to be equal to the ratio of the MPL in cloth to the MPL in machines, which is equal to the relative price of machines under perfect competition. With trade, given our previous illustration, the same analytics as before occur. The relative price of machines in the US goes up and falls in India. Similarly, the relative price of cloth falls in the US and increases in India until there is convergence in relative prices to the same thing across countries. Here I call the converged relative price of machines PM over PCG. As before, consumption possibilities increase for both countries. Depicting this graphically for the US, we see the following. First, under autarky, production and consumption take place at the point of tangency between indifference curve IC1 and the PPF. The slope at that point is given by the line tangent to both curves at their point of tangency, which is PM over PC. With trade, PM over PC, the relative price of machine rises and settles at PM over PCG. This is shown by the green line that's still tangent to the PPF. As seen, it's tangent to the PPF, reflecting the new production point, and also a higher indifference curve IC2 is tangent to it, reflecting post-trade consumption in the US. More precisely, the gains from trade are depicted in this graph, which provide a little more detail. Autarky production and consumption is at point A. Post-trade production is now at point B, but post-trade consumption is at point C. This means that in the US, trade does not lead to complete specialization, only to specialization that is in the direction of comparative advantage. The US at point B produces more machines than before, but still produces cloth. However, to move to the higher consumption bundle at point C on a higher indifference curve, it exports some of its machine for additional cloth imports from India. Similarly, for India, we first see that under autarky, India would be at the point where its highest possible indifference curve is tangent to its PPF. This is seen at the point of tangency of indifference curve IC1 star and the PPF, with the red line tangent to both at that point, whose slope is PM star over PC star, which is the relative price of machines in India. However, with trade, the relative price of machine converges to PM over PCG, which is the green line, which is flatter and represents a smaller slope and still is tangent to the PPF. This green line is tangent to India's PPF, reflecting a new production choice, but it also allows a higher indifference curve IC2 to be tangent to it, reflecting a new higher consumption choice after trade. Again, we can show this with a little more detail. Point A is the autarky production and consumption choice in India. Post-trade production moves to point B, and post-trade consumption is at point C. Similar to that in the US, India does not completely specialize, but specializes only in the direction of its comparative advantage by producing more cloth. So India still produces machine as well after trade, but it achieves its higher consumption bundle on indifference curve IC2 star by exporting some of its cloth for machine imports from the US. What are the results then from modifying the Ricardian model to include multiple factors? The PPF becomes non-linear and specialization is incomplete. However, trade still provides mutual gains for both countries. The basis for these gains is still dependent on comparative advantage through specialization in that direction, even though both industries remain in operation in both countries. To summarize, trade still provides for mutual gains, and this is seen specifically with the inclusion of preferences and in the modified model with multiple factors. What drives the outcome in the Ricardian model with preferences included is still the difference in technology that results in labor productivity differences across countries. However, in the modified model, what drives comparative advantage is not labor productivity differences per se, and we have not yet identified that clearly. We shall do so over the next 2 lectures. What are our next steps at this point? Well, if you have not yet read through chapter 2, you want to make sure you do so. Take the quiz associated with this lecture, and then get started on lecture 4, which introduces the specific factors model of trade. This is chapter 3 content.